Is this the best they could send? Choi Do-hyun's voice was a low, dangerous rasp that cut through the rhythmic patter of the Seoul rain. He didn't wait for an answer. With a sharp, mechanical click, he flicked the safety off his 9mm. The sound echoed off the narrow alley walls like a death knell. He stepped toward the shadow hunched against the rear tire of his black sedan, a silhouette he assumed was a hitman waiting to end his life. But as he moved into the halo of a flickering street lamp, the air left his lungs. There was no weapon. There was only a shock of bright, wrinkled red, a delivery polo shirt damp with mist. Abina's head was tilted back against the cold metal of the car, her red cap pulled low, shielding eyes that were tightly shut in a sleep so deep it looked like a trance. Beside her, the insulated delivery bag sat slumped and open, a pathetic testament to a shift that had clearly lasted too many hours. Duyung froze. His tattooed hand, usually steady enough to kill without a tremor, shook slightly as he lowered the weapon. He leaned in, his sharp jawline tightening. He wasn't looking at the girl's exhaustion anymore. He was staring at the silver ring hanging from a cord around her neck. It was a ring he hadn't seen in 10 years. Not since the night he was pulled from a prison fire by a man who didn't survive to see the sunrise. "Hey!" he commanded, though the word lacked its usual bite. "Wake up!" Abina didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, her lips gently parted, her deep brown skin looking almost gray under the harsh city lights. She looked less like an assassin and more like a discarded doll. "I said move." Suddenly, the heavy metal door at the end of the alley slammed open. Laughter, jagged and cruel, spilled into the space. 3 men stepped out, led by a man whose face was a map of scars, Snake Eye. He stopped short when he saw the girl, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "There she is," Snake Eye sneered, ignoring the man in the tailored suit for a moment. "Sleeping on the job again, Abina? That's another $50 added to the debt. You're gonna be working for me until you're dead at this rate." He stepped forward to kick her foot, but he never got the chance. Do-hyun stepped into the light. The rain slicked back his jet-black hair, making the ink on his neck look like a living shadow. He didn't raise his gun. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his presence made the 3 men stumble back as if hit by a physical wall. "She's not your debt anymore," Do-hyun said. The quietness of his voice was more terrifying than a shout. "Who the hell are you?" Snake Eye barked, though his knees had started to shake. "This is our business. She's a nobody, a barren, broken little—" "She is mine," Do-hyun interrupted. Abina's eyes fluttered open then. She looked up, her vision blurred by the rain and the sudden, sharp throb in her chest, that familiar, terrifying skip of her heart. She saw a man who looked like a god of war kneeling in front of her. She expected a blow, a shove, a demand for the food. Instead, she felt heat. Do-hyun ignored the thugs completely. He holsters his weapon and reached down, sliding one tattooed arm under her salt-stained shoulders and the other beneath her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against the expensive silk of his black shirt. For the first time in years, Abina felt the world stop spinning. "Close your eyes," Do-hyun whispered against her hair as he turned his back on the stunned gang. "I'm taking you home." Then she gently put her into the back seat of the luxury sedan, instructed the drive to drive off. The engine of the black sedan hummed with a predatory stillness, as Do-hyun watched Abina disappear into the maw of a crumbling apartment complex. She hadn't looked back once. Her gait was stiff, her shoulders squared with a stubbornness that seemed to be the only thing keeping her upright. He should have driven away. He had a territory meeting in Gangnam and a shipment to track, yet he remained anchored to the curb, his gaze fixed on the peeling yellow paint of the building's entrance. When she emerged 10 minutes later, she wasn't wearing the damp red cap, but the red polo shirt remained, a target in the gray twilight. Her delivery bike was nowhere to be seen. She began to walk, her pace rhythmic but painfully slow, clutching a small thermal bag to her chest. Do-hyun trailed her from a block behind, his headlights extinguished. He watched through the dark tint of his windows as she navigated the jagged cracks of the sidewalk, moving deeper into the district where the streetlights gave up and the shadows took over. She was completing her route on foot, a feat of sheer, exhausted will that made his own chest tighten. She turned into a vacant lot behind a shuttered grocery store, a shortcut that felt like a trap. Do-hyun's instincts, honed by years of surviving ambushes, screamed before the first shadow moved. Snake Eye and two of his lackeys stepped out from behind a rusted dumpster. The gang leader's laugh was a wet, grating sound. Walking now, Abina? You're getting slower. Customers don't like cold food, and I don't like late payments. Abina stopped. She didn't cower. Even from the car, Do-hyun could see the exhaustion weighing on her, but her chin remained tilted upward. I'll have the money by the end of the week, she said, her voice thin but steady. I'll take what you have now as a late fee. Snake Eye reached out, his hand darting into her pocket and ripping out a small wad of crumpled bills. Her tips, the literal price of her blood and sweat. He counted them with a mocking sneer, flicking a $1 bill back at her feet. Buy yourself some water. You look like you're about to drop dead. Inside the car, Do-hyun's hand whitened on the steering wheel, the leather creaking under the force of his grip. His other hand drifted to the door handle, his thumb tracing the cold metal. He wanted to step into that lot and show Snake Eye the true meaning of a debt, to leave them broken in the dirt where they belonged. But then he saw her eyes. Even as Snake Eye mocked her, Abina didn't look at the money on the ground. She stared directly into the bully's face with a fierce, flickering pride. A look that said she might be breaking, but she was not beaten. It was a warning. If he stepped in now, he wouldn't be saving her. He would be stealing the only thing she had left, her agency. Do-hyun stayed in the shadows, his heart drumming a dark, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He wouldn't save her yet, but he would make sure the world paid for making her fight this hard. The morning sun offered no warmth, only a harsh light that revealed the wreckage waiting for Abina in the alleyway behind her apartment. Do-hyun watched from the mouth of the street, his silhouette leaning against the cold brick, as she stood frozen before the twisted remains of her delivery bike. It wasn't just broken. It had been dismantled with a cruel, systematic precision. The frame was bent into a jagged V, the tires slashed, and the chain draped over the handlebars like a rusted noose. Snake Eye hadn't just taken her tips, he had taken her legs. Abina didn't scream. She didn't even cry. She simply reached out and touched the cold, mangled metal of the seat, her fingers trembling only slightly. Do-hyun felt a surge of cold fury that tasted like copper in his mouth. He could have replaced that bike 1,000 times over with the watch on his wrist, but he remained still, watching her process the death of her livelihood. When she finally turned away and began to walk, her pace was slower than the night before, a slight limp favoring her left side. She was heading toward the warehouse district, miles away, determined to check in for a shift she could no longer fulfill. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the city turned a bruised purple. Abina was walking home in the dark, her thermal bag empty, her movements sluggish and heavy. She was a lone red spark in a sea of predatory shadows. As she crossed the bridge over the Han River, a low, synchronized hum filled the air. One by one, four black SUVs glided out of the gloom, their polished paint reflecting the amber streetlights. They surrounded her, moving at a walking pace, a wall of steel and tinted glass that cut her off from the rest of the world. The lead vehicle slowed to a crawl, and the rear window slid down with a soft, expensive hiss. Do-hyun sat in the shadows of the plush leather interior. The walk is 4 miles from here, Abina, and the temperature is dropping. Abina didn't stop. She didn't even look at him, though the exhaust from his car clouded around her ankles. I've walked further, she rasped, her voice thick with fatigue. Get in the car, Do-hyun said. It wasn't a request. It was an order flavored with a rare, jagged edge of concern. Your bike is scrap. You've done enough for one day. Abina finally stopped. She turned her head, her deep brown skin looking luminous against the dark backdrop of the river. Her eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting a war since she was born. "I don't take rides from men with guns, Mr. Choi," she said, her voice echoing off the concrete barriers. "And I don't accept charity from people who watch from the shadows while I bleed." She turned and kept walking, her silhouette small and defiant against the looming skyline. Do-hyun watched her through the glass, his heart giving a strange, uncomfortable thud. She was dying on her feet, her pride the only thing keeping her heart beating, and for the first time in his life, Choi Do-hyun felt utterly powerless. The silence of Abina's apartment was heavy, smelling of cheap detergent and the metallic tang of old pipes. Do-hyun moved through the cramped space like a phantom, his polished shoes silent on the linoleum. He had sent his men to keep watch at the street corner while she was at the pharmacy, giving him a window he shouldn't have taken. This was an intrusion, a violation of the very pride he admired, but the mystery of the ring around her neck had become a fever he couldn't break. His eyes scanned the small, neatly kept room. It was the home of someone who owned nothing but cherished everything. On a small nightstand sat a single, framed photograph. Do-hyun picked it up, and for a moment, the air in his lungs turned to ice. It was a younger version of the man from the prison fire, the one who had dragged a half-dead, tattooed boy through the smoke and heat, giving his last breath so Do-hyun could have a second chance. "Father," Do-hyun whispered, his thumb brushing the glass. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Abina wasn't just a stranger. She was the legacy of the only man who had ever truly loved him. His gaze shifted to a drawer that wasn't quite closed. Tucked beneath a stack of folded delivery shirts was a thick, manila folder. He pulled it out, expecting to find more debts or past due rent notices. Instead, he found a labyrinth of clinical terms and hospital stamps. His eyes blurred as he skimmed the pages. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Grade 4. High risk of sudden cardiac arrest. The documents were littered with denied insurance claims and a specialized treatment plan with a price tag that might as well have been $1 billion to a delivery girl. He looked at the most recent report, a warning from a doctor stating that her heart was thickening, losing the ability to pump blood. Every step she had taken that day, every heavy thermal bag she had carried, and every time she had climbed those stairs, she had been dancing on the edge of a cliff. Do-hyun felt a cold, visceral terror he hadn't felt since the night of the fire. He finally understood why she was so slow, why her lips were sometimes tinged with blue, and why she clutched her chest in the shadows. She wasn't just working to pay off a gang. She was working to buy the very right to breathe. The key turned in the lock. Do-hyun shoved the folder back into the drawer, his heart drumming a dark, frantic rhythm. He stood in the center of the room as the door swung open. Abina froze, her face pale, a small plastic bag of generic painkillers in her hand. She looked at him, then at the photo on the nightstand, and the air between them fractured with a secret that neither of them was ready to name. The Gwangjang market was a chaotic symphony of sizzling oil, shouting vendors, and the thick, heavy scent of spicy rice cakes. Abina moved through the crowd like a ghost, her movements sluggish as she carried a final, heavy order. Each breath felt like she was inhaling wet wool, her heart fluttering against her ribs in a panicked, irregular rhythm. She just needed to finish this shift. She just needed to survive the hour. The crowd suddenly parted, not for her, but for the storm following her. Snake Eye stepped out from behind a steaming stall, flanked by 4 men who looked like they enjoyed the cruelty they were about to inflict. He didn't say a word before reaching out and grabbing Abina's arm, twisting it until the delivery bag hit the floor with a dull thud. "You're late again, Abina," Snake Eye hissed, his breath foul against her ear. "The interest on your father's debt just doubled. Since you can't walk fast enough, maybe you can find the money on your knees." He shoved her. Abina hit the damp pavement, the rough concrete scraping her palms. The market-goers turned away, pulling their children closer, their eyes glued to the floor. No one wanted to see the tragedy unfolding. Snake Eye raised a heavy boot, ready to bring it down on her hand, when the world went silent. It wasn't a loud silence. It was the kind of hush that precedes a landslide. Choi Do-hyun walked into the center of the market. He wore no jacket today, just a crisp black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate, dark ink that climbed his forearms. He didn't have a weapon in his hand. He didn't have his guards behind him. He didn't need them. Snake Eye froze, his boot hovering in midair. Mr. Choi, this is just a small matter. A local debt. Do-hyun didn't look at him. He looked at Abina, sprawled in the dirt, her eyes wide and her chest heaving in shallow, terrifying gasps. The fury in Do-hyun's eyes was so cold it seemed to drop the temperature of the market by 10 degrees. He turned his gaze to Snake Eye, and the gang leader visibly recoiled. Kneel, Do-hyun said. The word wasn't a shout. It was a command from a king to a peasant. Sir, Snake Eye stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I said kneel. All of you. The weight of the Choi name, the reputation of a man who had built an empire on the bones of his enemies, crashed down on them. One by one, Snake Eye and his men hit the dirt, their foreheads pressed against the grime of the market floor, trembling in front of the delivery girl they had mocked moments before. Do-hyun stepped past them as if they were trash, reaching down to Abina. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew she wasn't. As he lifted her into his arms, she gasped, her hand clutching his shirt over his own heart. The debt is settled, Do-hyun announced to the silent market, his voice vibrating through Abina's trembling frame. And if any of you look at her again, you won't live long enough to regret it. As he carried her toward the exit, Abina's head slumped against his shoulder, her pulse a fading, frantic beat. He felt her slip into unconsciousness, a terrifying reminder that while he had broken the men who hunted her, he was still losing the war against her fading heart. Abina woke to a silence so profound it felt heavy. There was no sound of dripping pipes, no distant roar of city buses, only the faint, rhythmic hum of a high-end filtration system. When her eyes fluttered open, she didn't see the water-stained ceiling of her apartment. Instead, she stared up at a vast expanse of polished coffered wood and a chandelier that glittered like fallen stars. She tried to sit up, but a wave of vertigo sent her reeling back into the pillows. They were silk, cool, expensive, and smelling faintly of sandalwood and rain. The last thing she remembered was the cold grime of the market floor and the terrifying weight of Do-hyun's presence as he swept her into the sky. Don't move, a voice commanded from the shadows. Do-hyun was seated in a leather armchair across the room, his silhouette framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the shimmering, uncaring sprawl of Seoul. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, making the dark tattoos on his neck look like iron chains in the moonlight. Where am I? Abina rasped, her hand instinctively flying to her chest. Her heart felt sluggish, like it was moving through honey. My home. You're in the penthouse, he said, his voice flat but edged with a strange tension. My private doctors have stabilized you, but they were clear. You cannot go back to that alley, Abina. Not to that job, and certainly not to that apartment. I can't stay here, she whispered, her pride flaring even through her weakness. She looked at the marble floors and the gold-trimmed furniture. To her, they weren't luxuries. They were bars. I have shifts. I have a life. You're forcing me into a cage. Consider it debt repayment, he countered coldly, though he didn't look at her. You owe me for the intervention at the market. You stay here until I say otherwise. For 3 days she treated his palace like a prison. She refused the gourmet meals and stared defiantly at the security cameras. She resented his control, hating how he had used his power to overwrite her autonomy. But on the 4th night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the hallway. A sliver of light spilled from the cracked door of his private study. Abina stepped closer, intending to demand her phone back, but the words died in her throat. Do-hyun was hunched over a massive mahogany desk, his head buried in his hands. Scattered before him weren't ledgers of crime or maps of territory, but the manila folder from her apartment, her medical files. Under the harsh glow of a desk lamp, his face was stripped of its Mafia boss mask. He looked hollow, His features twisted in an expression of pure, helpless agony as he stared at the diagrams of her failing heart. In that moment, the walls she had built against him crumbled. She realized he wasn't her captor, and this wasn't about a debt. He was a man drowning in the fear of the inevitable, terrified of losing the only piece of the father who had saved him. He wasn't guarding a prisoner. He was guarding a miracle he didn't know how to fix. The following week, the air between them shifted. The sharp edges of Abina's resentment had been dulled by the sight of Do-hyun's vulnerability, and in return, he had softened his command to a request. He invited her to the rooftop garden, a hidden sanctuary of white lilies and weeping willows suspended 40 stories above the city's concrete heart. It was a rare night of peace, the wind carrying the scent of blooming jasmine rather than exhaust and rain. For the first time since the night in the alley, the tension in Abina's shoulders evaporated. As Do-hyun recounted a dry, biting observation about a rival's lack of taste, Abina felt a genuine spark of amusement. A sound erupted from her. A bright, melodic laugh that seemed to startle even the birds in the trees. It was a beautiful, defiant sound that filled the sterile penthouse air with life. Do-hyun stopped talking, his dark eyes fixed on her face, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. For one heartbeat, they weren't a king and a commoner, but two people sharing a moment of stolen light. But the light vanished in an instant. The laughter was cut short by a sharp, jagged gasp. Abina's face drained of color, turning a terrifying, ashen gray under the moonlight. Her hand flew to her chest, her fingers clawing at the fabric of her shirt as if she could manually jumpstart the muscle failing beneath it. Her knees buckled and she collapsed. Do-hyun caught her before she hit the stones, but the weight of her body felt different now, limp, cold, and slipping away. "Abina!" he roared, his voice cracking with a desperation that shattered his untouchable persona. The calm, calculated mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man possessed by terror, his composure replaced by a raw, guttural panic. He scooped her up and sprinted toward the private medical wing, his boots thundering against the marble floors he had once used to intimidate her. "Help her!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the sterile hallways, bringing guards and doctors scrambling to their feet. "Someone help her!" As the medical team tore her from his arms and rushed her behind swinging glass doors, Do-hyun stood in the hallway, his hands stained with the lilies she had dropped. He looked at his trembling palms, then at the rows of armed men standing at attention, ready to kill at his command. He looked at the vast, glittering empire visible through the windows. He realized then, with a soul-crushing clarity, that all his power, his feared name, and his millions of dollars were worth nothing. He could destroy cities and move mountains, but he was utterly powerless to make her heart beat for one more minute. The man who dealt in death was finally begging for life, and the silence of the hospital wing was the only answer he received. The rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor was the only thing keeping Do-hyun from coming apart. Behind the glass of the intensive care unit, Abina lay submerged in a sea of tubes and wires, her heartbeat a thin, erratic line that threatened to flatten at any second. His chief surgeon had been blunt. Her heart was too scarred, too weak for standard procedures. Her only hope lay in a proprietary experimental valve mapping technology held exclusively by the Shin Syndicate, his bloodiest rivals. By dawn, the penthouse was crowded with his highest-ranking advisors. "It's a trap, boss," his head of security hissed, gesturing to the contract on the mahogany desk. "The Shin family doesn't want a truce. They want the Incheon docks. If you sign over the shipping lanes, we lose 40% of our annual revenue. We'll be vulnerable. Your life won't be worth the paper this is printed on." Do-hyun didn't even look at the spreadsheets or the maps of his dwindling empire. He was staring at a small, red delivery cap he had kept from the alleyway. "Without the surgery, what is her chance?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Zero," the surgeon replied. "With it, perhaps 20%. "Then there is no choice," Do-hyun said. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs. He chose to go alone, refusing a vest, refusing a weapon. He wanted the Shin Syndicate to see exactly what he was willing to sacrifice. Walking into the heart of his enemy's fortress felt like walking into his own grave, but he didn't hesitate. The air in the Shin's boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent mockery of men who had waited years to see Choi Do-hyun fall. The rival chairman pushed the deed forward, a predatory glint in his eyes. You're trading the crown jewels of the Choi Empire for a girl who delivers noodles? You've gone soft, Do-hyun. I am trading a pile of concrete for the only thing that matters, Do-hyun replied, his voice steady as he signed his name in bold, black ink. He didn't haggle. He didn't threaten. He handed over the keys to his kingdom with a hand that didn't tremble. As he walked back to the car, leaving his power and his wealth behind on that table, he felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He was no longer the untouchable king of the underworld. He was just a man racing against the clock. He had traded his empire for a 20% chance, proving to the world, and to the silent girl fighting for her life, that the stranger he had found sleeping by his car had become more than a memory. She was his entire world, and he would burn every bridge he had built just to see her eyes open one more time. 6 months had passed since the night the world of the Choi Syndicate shrank to the size of a surgical suite. The bustling, dangerous energy of the docks now belonged to other men, and the whispers in the underworld spoke of a lion who had pulled his own teeth for the sake of a ghost. But inside the penthouse, the silence was no longer heavy. It was a sanctuary. On a mahogany shelf in the library, nestled between leather-bound classics and ancient maps, sat a faded red delivery cap. It was wrinkled and slightly stained by city rain, a humble relic of a life that felt like a dream from another century. Abina stood on the balcony, the cool evening breeze off the Han River tugging at the hem of her silk dress. The ashen hue that had once haunted her complexion was gone, replaced by a deep, healthy glow that radiated from within. She leaned against the railing, her fingers interlaced, watching the city lights flicker like distant embers. She didn't feel the crushing weight of exhaustion anymore, nor the sharp, terrifying flutter of a heart reaching its limit. Instead, there was only the rhythmic, powerful thrum of a steady pulse, a beat that felt like a gift. A shadow moved behind her, but she didn't flinch. She knew the cadence of his step, the weight of his presence. Do-hyun stepped into the moonlight, his dark suit discarded, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink that mapped his history. He stood behind her, his movements no longer driven by the frantic desperation of the hospital hallways, but by a quiet, grounded peace. He wrapped his tattooed arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. As he rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand slid down, his palm resting flat against the center of her chest. Beneath the silk he felt it, the strong, mechanical, and miraculous thud of her heart. It was the heartbeat he had bought with his empire, the rhythm he had traded his throne to preserve. "You're thinking about the alley," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her skin. Abina turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had traded his crown to become her shield. "I'm thinking about how lucky I was that your car was parked in that specific shadow," she said, a playful spark in her eyes. Do-hyun tightened his hold. He was no longer the feared boss of an untouchable syndicate, and she was no longer the girl drowning in a debt she didn't own. They were something else entirely, a family forged in fire and saved by a sacrifice the world would never understand. In the quiet of the Seoul night, they stood together, bound by a heart that had been mended by a man who was once told he had no heart at all. The empire was gone, but as her heart beat against his hand, Do-hyun knew he had never been more powerful.